Hello and welcome to Vendor Trash. Is the title a reference to my opinions, my drawing skills, or both? That's for you to decide. This week we're taking it easy with a good old top 10 list. I'll be ranking all the Dragonflight dungeons based on my personal preference. This will include Dawn of the Infinite, which I will split into its two M+ halves. I would consider now probably the best time to rank them, considering we are at the end of the expansion and in Season 4, which featured all 8 of the original Dragonflight dungeons. This was actually the first season where I pushed M+ enough to unlock the dungeon teleports, which are currently tied to timing a +10 on either Tyrannical or Fortified. I do also have all of the Mop and Wad teleports, but those were unlocked from challenge modes. Admittedly, in Season 3, I only bothered enough to get KSM, so my experience with Dawn of the Infinite is not quite as thorough as the other ones. But without further ado, let's get into the list. At 10th place, I have Dawn of the Infinite Galakron's Fall. This is the first half of the dungeon, which includes the bosses Chronocar, Manifested Timeways, Blight of Galakron, and a Ritterkron. I feel like Dawn had a lot of potential to be a really awesome dungeon, but was held back massively by its structure. You basically run through the same areas twice, which feels a bit too erratic and ultimately doubles the rate at which you get burnt out from the environment. Conceptually, the idea of having to turn back time a bit to fix things is cool, but in practice it just doesn't work. I feel like Blizzard was a little too married to the idea of having a mega dungeon with precisely 8 bosses, and they just shouldn't be. Were it up to me, I would have cut out some of the unnecessary feeling bosses, such as Blight of Galakron and Time Lost Battlefield, and take out the backtracking. Additionally, I probably would have just cut out the entire Dragonblight section. Ultimately, this is kind of dependent on what the Dark Heart winds up being, and if a Ritterkron going back in time to access Galakron's corpse actually winds up being a necessary plot point. Though even if it is, you could have told that through a story quest. But the Timeways themselves are actually pretty cool. I feel like that could have been the dungeon, the Timeways, not this whole Dawn of the Infinite thing. Though it probably doesn't help that I wasn't exactly satisfied with how they resolved the Infinite Dragon plotline either. Anyways, mechanically, I think the place is fine. There isn't any trash that really aggravated me. The bosses are also all fine. I think Chronocar is a pretty solid one, and a Ritterkron is particularly standout. He really feels like a powerful raid boss that we're trying to handle as a 5-man team plus Chromie, and his Stonecracker barrage just feels so good. But for the aforementioned reasons, that wasn't enough to save it from being at the bottom of this list. In 9th place, we have the Nokud Offensive. I very much wanted to put this one at the bottom, and only didn't because of Dawn essentially being the same dungeon twice. There is just so much to hate about this place. It's not even really a dungeon, they just took half of the Onaran Plains and turned it into one. I hate when dungeons aren't their own place, and this could be the worst offender in the whole game. It feels like it's just a glorified scenario. On top of that, they allowed skywriting inside of it, so that is your main means of traveling between bosses and between even trash packs. I am not a fan of flying inside of dungeons and raids, and personally, I don't really enjoy skywriting. Now, that's a hot take, but in practice here, you wind up just flying in a bunch of parabolas, and it gets so tedious. The background music is also very repetitive. The trash to the first boss is some of the most unforgiving in the whole expansion. Basically, if too many of the centaurs decide to pick on the same target, they're dead. I hope you enjoy flying back from Marukai. The bosses are okay, nothing fantastic really. Except for the second boss, the Raging Tempest. This one just feels unforgivingly overtuned. It's fairly straightforward and definitely not the worst boss in the expansion, but it has definitely dismantled its fair share of pugs. And as if that all weren't bad enough, I believe it is the longest M+ dungeon of the expansion. If I recall correctly, its timer is 40 minutes, which is just way too much for a place I already hate. At the time of this recording, the War Within hasn't launched yet, but from what I hear, there is another dungeon in there that employs skywriting, and all I can say is I hope it winds up being less egregious because this just ain't fun. In 8th place, we have Uldaman Legacy of Tyr. For the most part, I actually really enjoy this one. It's got a nice cozy feel to it. I enjoy all of the first 4 bosses, and I think it's kind of neat that they're all in the first 60% of the dungeon. It just gives the place a very unique pace, although I know some people hate how long that last stretch is. The locations of the first 2 bosses are a bit unfortunate. Because Bromok is such an ad-intensive fight, it's usually worth it to Lust there. And Lust is also very lucrative on Emberon, the 4th boss, because managing to avoid an extra intermission phase saves a ton of time. And if the run is taken long enough, you could get a 3rd Lust for the last boss. Fortunately though, Lost Dwarves and Bromok aren't that far apart, so it's not a huge deal. I don't particularly care for Deos as the last boss. It just feels like the room fills up a bit too much too quickly, and it winds up feeling kind of claustrophobic. But the thing that really holds this dungeon back is that for the first chunk of the dungeon, you're literally in a higher resolution version of the original Uldaman. And then, even though the rest of the dungeon is technically new area, and I ran through old Uldaman just to make sure, the architecture and geography just feels so reminiscent that you could swear you are in the original Uldaman. But aside from those 2 things, it's a pretty neat dungeon. In 7th place, we have Dawn of the Infinite, Murazan's Rise. This is the second half of the dungeon that features Tyr the Infinite, Morchi, Time Lost Battlefield, and Chronolord Deos. What's holding it back is everything that I already mentioned with Galakrond's Fall. I just happen to enjoy this one more as a standalone M+ dungeon. Most of the bosses are pretty solid, though I could really do without Time Lost Battlefield. Morchi is probably the most entertaining one. I do think it's pretty lame that Deos showed up again as the end boss of a 2nd dungeon in the same expansion, but at least his fight here is a lot less annoying than in Uldaman. I like that this half of the dungeon lets you stay in the time ways a little bit more, and I do enjoy the little gauntlet after Tyr. The fact that players who do get through it can channel to end it early for other players is a nice little touch that helps avoid a situation where you're waiting forever on one guy who just can't get through it. So yeah, this place had a lot more potential, but unfortunately they milked it a bit too much. In 6th place, we have Algathar Academy. I know a lot of people really love this one, but it just wasn't that great for me. It just felt very middle of the road. Except for Overgrown Ancient, because I freaking hate that boss. You're supposed to stack on the tank and move with them during Germinate, but doing that always got me killed, so I started just sort of going a little bit ahead of them, which worked out better, but then I feel like I'm doing it wrong, and making things harder for my party, even though empirically I'm not. The rest of the place is okay though. There's nothing else that I particularly hate, there's just nothing else that I particularly love either. Now, you may be asking why I gave No Coot Offensive so much flack when other dungeons like this one are also available in the open world, but to me the difference is that areas like Algathar don't really serve much other function in the game. They are primarily a dungeon, and they just so happen to have an open world version that you can go and run around in. Alright, we're in the top half now with number 5, Neltharis. Aesthetically and mechanically, I have no real complaints, other than maybe Chargath being a bit tricky for pugs. But the place is pretty neat, and I love the layout. You have choices, but sort of just keep naturally looping back towards the middle, with the only real egregious backtracking being after Forge Master Gore. My only real criticisms is that it feels a bit samey with most of the mobs and 3 of the bosses being Jarradin, and the fact that everything hits like a truck. The place just felt really overtuned, and I think because of that, it was the last dungeon I got a +10 in. And I guess if you wiped in the wrong spot, the runs back could be kind of punishing. But all in all, a pretty okay experience. In 4th place, we have the Ruby Life Pools. It is a gorgeous set piece, particularly the bottom of the pools where you fight Meladrusa. None of the trash really bothered me either, although I know a lot of people hate the ring before the second boss. It didn't bother me though, and I actually enjoy the second boss as well. Really, my only 2 complaints were A, having to sneak around the Proto-Drakes if your group didn't want to kill them, and B, the 3rd boss, Kairaka and Urquhart. There just can be a lot going on in that fight, and one of them is flying around, so it's not the most straightforward encounter to keep an eye on everything. But all in all, I loved going here, and having a 3-boss dungeon is a nice change of pace from the standard 4. Taking home the bronze, we have Brackenhide Hollow. It's kind of of refreshing dealing with gnolls again after all this time. There is a ton of freedom in which mobs you pull to get your count, and even a bit in the path you take. All of the bosses are quite enjoyable as well, especially Gutshot and Decatriarch Rathai. Really, the only critique I have for it is that I don't think there are any checkpoints, so once you get to about Treemouth, you're better off just waiting to get rezzed. And I feel like the Decatriarch is a plot thread that was supposed to be resolved in a hypothetical Vakthros raid, but I'm not going to hold that against the dungeon itself. The silver medal goes to Halls of Infusion. I know a lot of people absolutely hate this place, but I also feel like a lot of that hatred came from before they added a checkpoint at the second boss. Simply put, I enjoy everything about this dungeon. The environment is pretty cozy, I like all of the water. The fact that we as the players are kind of perpetuating the infusion of order magic into the water is a little ethically dubious. But yeah, I enjoy all 4 of the bosses. They all have a good rhythm to them, and I like that the end of the dungeon is actually right below where you start. And yeah, I don't really have anything else to say. There really is more to talk about when you don't like something. And our grand champion is the Azure Vault. This place is gorgeous. Perhaps a bit derivative of the Nexus, but it makes sense that it would be. The simulacrum of Sindragosa has been an absolute delight, and I'm glad that she follows us through the place. I love that the first boss room is this garden that Malagos gave to her. I love that Azure Blade delegates tasks to her mirror images with the whole, like, me, take care of them. The last boss is a bit of a sad note, but mechanically, he's great. I know a lot of groups have trouble killing the big crystal in time, but that never really seemed to be a problem for mine. If I had to critique one thing, it would be that I don't like that we have to use the books to get around. I will always prefer when dungeons are designed to allow you to run through them normally. But that's me really nitpicking. I absolutely adore this dungeon, and I'm always excited when I get to go there. I know Dragonflight dungeons receive a lot of criticism. Lots of people say as a complete set, it's one of the worst we've ever gotten, and I don't know if I agree with that. Only Noku Defensive was outright bad, and I would give some slack to Uldaman and Dawn of the Infinite for just retreading area. But other than that, they were pretty solid. There is one criticism that I do agree with though. Blizz decided that they wanted to make trash more dangerous, and I think they overshot it there. It feels like every trash bowl has one or more lethal abilities that you need to interrupt, and the most effective way to do this is with AoE stops, which themselves have become more abundant over the years. We sort of wound up in an arms race where we have to stop more abilities, so we have more abilities to stop those abilities. And of course, Vengeance Demon Hunters became the kings of these AoE stops. I hope that things trend in the other direction going forward. I don't think we need to be stressed on every pull of the dungeon. And in the War Within, any plus 10 or higher keys will have both Fortified and Tyrannical, which means Blizzard doesn't really have to tune things to make sure that Tyrannical keys aren't a complete pain in the rump compared to Fortified. But time will tell. For this week's drawing, I decided to go with a landscape here. I'm probably going to do that for every video that focuses on dungeons or zones and the like. And of course, I had to give it to the gold medal winner. I would like to do one of these videos for every expansion, but obviously the others are not as fresh in my mind, nor did I do them as thoroughly as Dragonflight's. So I'm sure they'll be coming, but probably not in the immediate future. And that is it for this episode. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you next week. Bye-bye.